Why is my dad texting me? Hopefully nobody's out. It's like, no, he's asking stock advice. Did I sign in previously from my computer? Yes. We might have found a cute box. This working group used to be popular. All right, well, it is 12:30. We're going to give it a couple minutes. There's a grand total of 5 people in here, and some others are straggling in. So we also are not going to take the full 2 hours. So everybody just kind of relax for a little bit. Hey, Richard.
It is popular. We're just, popular from.
Well, I know you're nearly finished, so it's good, and I see most of the usual suspects from the interim in the chat there, so that's good. Rohan, hopefully your travels back home were good, and the party last night was rocking. He went home for his mom's birthday, so yeah. So for those that are remote, I've got all the slides lined up. So when you're presenting and you want to go to the next slide, just say next. We have a minute. Oh, that's a good question.
Is anyone in the room or online willing to be note taker? I still need to get the chat open to see.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we'll try not to get so close, Jonathan. Is that better when I'm sitting farther away?
Sounds fine to me.
No, it's a template, so whatever. Oh, it's empty? That's weird. That's not what I would have expected. I can fill in the outline. Either it's fine, yeah, as long as I'm not on the wrong page, that's the right page that nobody will ever see. It's the right page. How can we do that online? 23. I'd say that's a pretty good way to start. All right, well, let's get started here. Welcome to the LMS Working Group. It's the end of the week. Hopefully everybody's seen all the slides a couple of times. If you didn't mean to be here, go back to bed or go have lunch or wherever you are, your time zone. Here's the note. Well, it's the end of the week. Again, you should have seen this. This is the say something if you know something about IPR, other policies about, not harassing each other, code of conduct, and the like. We'd also like to bring up the IETF code of conduct guidelines, which are enshrined in RFC 7154 about treating colleagues with respects. The one that I think they put in for me, which is to speak slowly and limit the use of slang, dispute ideas with reasoned argument, use best engineering judgment, find the best solution for the whole of the internet, contribute to the ongoing work of the IETF, and remind yourself that these applies both to in-person and in Jabber, Zulip, or wherever the heck you are when you're contributing. In this working group, we've had, I think, 0 problems, and that's been very nice. All right, our agenda. So another reminder, if you're local and you're in the room, mask up. I will call you out. We just did the note well.
Maybe get a little closer to the mic.
Sorry?
A little closer to the mic, please.
Yeah, sure. The note well, if you're local, please use the online tool so that we can manage the queue fairly with those that are remote. We've identified a note taker. Thank you to our area director. We have a Jabber scribe. Somebody I assume is in the chat room that will, thank you, DKG. We're going to go through some quick status. And then basically the agenda is to talk about the drafts that we have and one that's up for consideration. The two are the protocol and the architecture document, the federation document extensions, and content negotiation. Any agenda bashing? All right. So our status. We've got our architecture draft, which is basically waiting on the chairs to complete the review to get to the AD. Technically, I'm waiting on all of the authors to respond to the questions before I send it to Paul. And I started that wrangling, I think, yesterday afternoon, so it shouldn't take that long. The Federation draft, we actually revived since the last meeting, and the extensions draft is brand new. And this is our little, for those who don't know how this works, this is kind of the winding path that we go through to get to an RFC. And we're after working group last call. I've changed these slides over time. So if you remember to look back at the other ones, the list of drafts 12 through 16 were kind of spread out on the rest of the path. And as usual, sometimes you do a working group last call and then you iterate a bunch before you actually get out the door. So that's basically what happened. We may even have another one before we end up sending it to Paul, or before it goes on to the ISG, because Paul will have his comments and that may result in changes as well. And so we just kind of iterate through the drafts as we go through the various processes. And that is it for the status update. I guess I'd say I didn't make one of these for the architecture document because they're going to kind of have to go together, and so the numbers are different, but it got last called and got reviewed. What I was really happy with during the working group last call for the protocol document was that, when we started this whole process, we made this kind of like promise with the security researchers, like to take their input, and they actually provided input directly back to us to say, hey, we thought it was good. So I'm pretty happy with that. All right, Richard, you're up.
Yeah, I have requested. Oh, you can just drive this. I'll cancel my.
Yeah, I'll drive it.
All right, so I mean, this is a super quick update on the protocol document because we had several interims where we covered all the interesting stuff, and now we're kind of in quiet period waiting for the AD to review. But I thought I'd at least give the folks in the room a brief catch up on what's happened since the last IETF meeting. So next slide, please. So since the last IETF, we had a working group last call for shortly after the IETF. That led to a bunch of good comments, got a bunch of good feedback as a result of that last call. Had several interims every couple of weeks thereafter, trying to get work through those. So it took us, 3 or 4 cycles to get through that, but that led to draft 15, which was last called again, and that one went clean. I think there was just a couple minor edits I'll talk about in a second. That was draft 16, and here we are. I think it's draft 16. We're ready to go to the AD. Next slide, please. So just brief update on draft 15. This is the changelog. I've been doing this the last few drafts. Like you can see, there's a bunch of substantive stuff here, which got fixed in as a result of working group last call. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to go through the first one because it's the biggest one. It's kind of the most substantial one. Next slide, please. One of the things that was noted as folks were taking a detailed look at the algorithms was there were some cases where there are ambiguities that had arisen because we were suppressing redundant nodes, and so you wouldn't always have, a path that would go all the way to the root of a tree and things like that. So the change that was made to kind of simplify and disambiguate a few things was to change from using a left balanced binary tree to using a balanced binary tree, always having a full tree, so a number of leaves, it's a power of 2. So mechanistically what this means is that when you grow the tree, when you add people to a group and you need to make the tree bigger, the way you add, before the way you add was you would add 1 leaf and adjust the tree structure so that it was left balanced. Now instead of adding 1 leaf, you double the size of the tree and you add 1 leaf and a bunch of blanks. So that means you have bigger trees, logically speaking. And the other mechanistic view is when you remove people from the group, you kind of garbage collect the tree as you go. Before, as when adding, you would remove the last leaf and you would remove individual leaves until you got to the next non-blank leaf. With this, when you remove the last person out of that right-hand subtree, you cut the tree in half, you take the left subtree, and so on until you get to the next non-blank leaf. So you have this kind of doubling and halving style of change to the tree as opposed to one by one, more continuous change. This makes the tree math a lot simpler as a nice consequence, and especially around the parent hash. A lot of the complexity we had around the parent hash was the need to kind of recompute an earlier form of the tree structure at the time the parent hash was computed. Here, we don't change the structure of the tree. Once a node is in place, like the structure beneath it doesn't change. So we save a lot of complexity there. So like I said a moment ago, you end up with a lot of extra blank nodes on the right edge of the tree in some cases. So, and as I've shown in the bottom here, when you add the 9th leaf, you end up with 7 extra blank nodes in all their parents. The reason I think folks felt comfortable with this is these nodes are all virtual. They're all guaranteed to be blank by the algorithms that we apply here. And so you never have to worry about any content to the right of the rightmost blank leaf. So you can kind of generate these on the fly as you need them. And the only time you ever need them is when you're computing the tree hash of the overall tree. And even for that, you can kind of pre-compute the subtrees you're likely to need, the all blank subtrees at certain positions in the tree. So even though there's a bunch of kind of extra nodes in theory here, they don't actually end up having much performance impact on the protocol. So that's the biggest change in draft 15. In draft 16 was, again, after our second last call, didn't really get any substantive comments here. I think Teofil Juarez noticed that there was a field missing in the to be signed version of group info. We added that back. Colin suggested we move a reference from normative to informative, so made that change. That's the only stuff in the diff. It was such a fascinating diff that I forgot to include a change log. So there'll be a gap in the change log for that. Maybe I'll fill it in 17 if we have that. So with that, yeah, we are ready to go. So Paul, look for this on your desk as soon as Sean gets it together. Questions or comments?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be good. The write-up will be done probably sometime next week, and then I'll pass it over to you. And depending upon your vacation schedule for the rest of the summer, we'll get through it. So I'm hoping, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can start the reviews because you'll press the button, before the end of August. And then for those who might not have been involved in the IETF for a long time, the cycle will kind of continue. We'll get director reviews from other areas. So they'll start looking at all kinds of things that we never even thought about, and we'll have to address those comments as we move forward. So, okay, so next, I believe, is Benjamin. He doesn't have slides, but that's all right. Is he here?
So I don't actually see Benjamin in the room.
All right, well, I mean, so the nice thing is the architecture document was kind of like, it's the one that's going to go with the protocol document and explains a bunch of things. And I think he was really good about keeping them aligned to make sure things are explained. So mostly what he said in an email to me was there are some things that we could talk about that we could do for the future, but I think we should get done what we're doing now before moving on to the next thing, because that often causes problems. So, all right, well, that then we'll move over to Raphael. And I see him there. All right.
All right. Hey, everyone. So I think Sean already said it, the allocation of the time slots have been relatively generous. I don't think we're going to need that much time. So especially since last time we already touched on the federation document. So this is actually just a brief overview again for those who didn't attend last time. So the federation document has been there for a while. It's been updated now. And then we also want to talk about a brand new document, like Sean said, the extensions document. Next slide, please. So the federation document hadn't seen any updates in a while. And so now the scope is more clear than in the beginning. So this is clearly a non-normative document. Conceptually more like the architecture document, but with a narrower scope, focusing on interop and federation and outlining different deployment scenarios giving some high-level guidelines on how applications could structure things, whether it's different servers that interoperate or clients from different vendors that all talk to the same server. There are a few security considerations as well. And it was adapted to the newer versions of the protocol draft. So since it's not normative, it's not prescriptive in the way of how federation should be done with MLS. It's really just there to give an overview. It doesn't give any wire format for messages in a federated context or anything like that. So I think there was a consensus that we said that the charter of this working group shouldn't accommodate for that. So in a way, it's a bit of a placeholder in the sense that it would be nice going forward to have normative documents that describe all of these different aspects of federation. And that might very well be the case going forward, for example, with the soon to be, hopefully, MIMI working group. And once that is there and the scopes are aligned, then potentially this document could actually reference specific normative documents there. Yeah, that was federation. Next slide. Thank you. So yeah, just to zoom out a bit, over the past few years, we've really tried to make MLS work for really different kinds of deployment types, different applications, etc. So the outcome of that is that the MLS protocol is relatively versatile. Just to give an example, there are several ways of how members can be added to a group, and depending on how the application works specifically. But at some point, we also had to draw the line when it comes to things that are too specific and not general enough. So the idea here was to outsource that into an extensions document. So we specifically started with the app-ACK mechanism that used to be in the MLS protocol document. And that is now the first extension in the MLS extensions document. There is a PR for something that we discussed in the past, and there are a few applications that were interested in it, and that is targeted messages. So that's not in the document yet, and it's going to need some more review, but it's a start. I see Rowan, you put your hand up.
Go ahead.
Do you want to say anything, Rowan?
Yeah. It just took a really long time for my mute button to turn off. So thanks for writing this up, Raphael. My only question here is whether we want to have individual like small documents where we have an MLS app-ACK document and an MLS targeted messages document. My intuition is that having a handful of small ones is better than having one sort of, one catch-all, because the maturity of the individual extensions may be very different, and the security considerations would be easier to understand if they are individual. So that's just a preference. I don't have a huge, strong feeling, but just something I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, and I think we discussed it in the past as well. So I guess for now the consensus is that we should have this one document, especially since what we are concretely discussing is relatively small. What wouldn't work, for example, is if we had extensions that are very complex and that would mandate a very long description, etc. So that would put too much strain on the extensions document, and in that case, it would probably have to be a separate document. But the idea was to see if we can collect some of these low-hanging fruits, essentially. That's in the case of the app-ACK mechanism that didn't make it into the protocol, and that's relatively short. The same goes for targeted messages. But it's not prohibitive, I think, in the sense that you could always have an extra document for something much more specific. Richard.
Yeah, I was just gonna basically post on what Raphael said. I looked into the kind of precedent for this in the IETF stream. The apps comparison here that I found was RFC 6066, which I linked in the chat, which is a bucket of small extensions to TLS that was published shortly after TLS 1.2. So it seems like that there's precedent for either approach here. I think Raphael's spot on that if these are small things that aren't sort of big enough and complex enough to merit their own documents, then it's fine to just make a document that has several of them together. And I'll note that 6066 that I liked has such important things as things like server name indication and the OCSP stapling extension as well. So there's some widely used extensions that went in there, but still were simple enough to get a multi-extension document.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Very good point.
Yeah, so I mean, on that point, Ron, I think basically if somebody's really hard over on wanting to make sure there's like a generic extensions document and then little ones and littler ones for the actual extensions themselves, and they can get to the microphone, but I think this is a editorial kind of thing, and I think maybe the ISG will get through easier because there's an actual extension in the extension document from the chew-on. I can imagine some, if we send a blank extension document forward to them and they'd be like, well, what are you going to use it for if you don't need it? Why are you wasting our time? So I don't know. I can kind of see it both ways. So unless somebody really has a strong opinion about this, we're just going to launch forward. All right.
So yeah, that's pretty much the status quo for extensions. I'm curious to see if folks have comments on it going forward. In a way, this might also be the escape hatch for things that we didn't think about in the context of the protocol, but that we now discover as we implement MLS into existing systems.
Can I see a show of hands for people who have read the draft in the room? Let me get rid of it. All right, so there was nobody raised their, or one. Thank you, Mallory, that have read it. So we'll have to beat the drum. Granted, it's a new draft, so it maybe that's understandable. And unless there's anything else, I think we're going to hand it over to Ron. Okay, thanks, Raphael.
Okay. I did a document on content negotiation. Has anybody read this document?
Not seen any hands other than mine.
Okay, I saw Raphael's and Sean's. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, so the problem that I wanted to solve are two problems. So right now there's no way to find out which application formats are supported and which application formats are required in a particular group. And then there also is no way in MLS to signal, well, what's the format of application data, because it's completely opaque. That attribute makes it really difficult, for example, if you have a long-lived group, like in an instant messaging context, you could easily imagine a group that has been around for 2, 3, 5 years. Switching content formats because you upgraded some software, because you added a new feature, that's really difficult if you don't have some kind of content negotiation mechanism. And interoperability is also challenging if you had initially one heterogeneous set of clients and then you want to do interoperability with another client. It's nice if you can have a way to say, oh, here's my proprietary format, or here's the standards-based format, and that you can negotiate among them. Next slide, please. So I wrote up another 2 MLS extensions as a proposal. One is a list of accepted media types which would be in a key package. So when you publish a key package, you can list this, and you can just go nuts and list a bunch of different media types that you support for your particular client. And then in the group context, then there's a separate extension, required media types. And so if the creator of a group wanted to say all members in this group need to support this this media type or this list of media types, they could express that with the required media types extension. So what is a media type? There is if you're using HTTP, you're using them every day. There's an extensive IANA media types registry. You probably have seen the, image JPEG, text plain, text markdown, but there's an extensive list that already exists. You can define new ones via I think a specification. By providing a specification, you can get a new registration. And then there's also a vendor space that you can use if you don't want to bother doing a registration, but just want to register something like, VND for vendor .example corp plus whatever format type you want to call your thing. You can just start using that. You don't need anyone's permission to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the format of an MLS of the application data in an MLS message, this extension says, okay, if there's a required media types in the group context, then that implies that you want to use this additional little very lightweight application framing, which uses the TLS presentation language. So there's the struct right here. There is a single media type, and then there is the rest of your application content. And the media type itself, it could be a zero length vector. And if you put a zero length vector there, then this proposal says, assume the first media type listed in the required media types list. So if you wanted to use this application framing, the amount of extra overhead is very small. It would be between 3 and 4 bytes if you think you're always going to be sending the same media type. And if you want to be able to do something in the future and use a different media type, then you can still do that. And there's no confusion about what the format is of the application data. Ted.
Howdy. I actually put my hand up when we were still talking about the IANA registry aspect of it, and I'm going to suggest that you may want to think about how you interact with the registry a little bit more in depth, because in addition to having some top-level types, which are almost certainly going to be very difficult to imagine use here, like model, there are also a whole bunch of media types where the interesting bits actually start occurring in the parameters rather than in the media type itself. So when you're looking at the media type here, you may want to think about whether you want to break it down into media type and parameters and carry those separately in the application content here so that people can actually do the kind of content negotiation applications that you actually see in other protocols. And I will tell you that having led one of those content negotiation working groups through to its fiery death, ConEgg, that there are a whole bunch of these things that people do add as bells and whistles that don't get used, but then there are also some aspects of it that you really do need that go beyond just the media type itself. So I would suggest making this a little bit more complex in the structure to allow for required parameters and also to limit the number of media types you're actually willing, top level media types you're willing to deal with, just because otherwise you're probably going to give yourself a little bit of pain.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, in you can see in required media types wanting to specify parameters in required media types that may be a subset of what you would put in the media type in the application framing.
Yeah, so imagine that you have, here, I'm going to pick something out of the registry.
Say care set.
Yeah, so the car set, one of the most complex possible examples, but a good example despite that. You will find that there are going to be cases where you're like, look, I don't really speak anything but UTF-8, and so it's required that if you're going to specify a car set to your textual one, that it's going to be UTF-8. Because if you send me some weird old Japanese one from the 70s, I'm just going to bork all over you anyway, so you might as well give up now. So I think you need a little bit more complexity in the struct to handle permitted or required parameters. And I think you seriously want to take a look at the top level types and say, yeah, I probably don't ever want to send model or font as a top level type. You want to think about it, maybe you do, but I kind of doubt it.
Daniel Kahn Gilmore. Most of what I wanted to say, Ted has already said, so I want to +1 those comments. I wanted to also flag that in your example, you had mentioned multi-part alternative, which seems to imply like a MIME framing, but I don't see MIME in the rest of this. And so I just wanted to, maybe I'll add that to add multi-part to the list of scary things, scary top levels that you might want to consider ruling out here if you want this to be simple.
Okay,
I mean,
so before
I deal with email, and there's a lot of multi-part there, and multi-part is basically flexible enough to destroy you, or to destroy itself if you get it wrong. So, yeah, there's a lot of dragons there that I'm not sure you want to easily claim support for.
So before you sit down, I just want to say that the inclusion of multi-part alternative was intentional, because I think we want the semantics of multi-part alternative. And if somebody wants to propose some alternate syntax that doesn't use MIME boundaries, then that would be welcome. And I also can imagine a number of multi-part types that I really, really like. Multi-part report is going to be completely irrelevant, I think, that we will never, ever want to use.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are a lot of libraries that are out there for dealing with MIME. And I'm not saying you shouldn't use MIME if you're going to do a multi-part alternative semantic. I'm just aware, as someone who tends to prefer to read the text plain parts of multi-part alternatives, that the intent of multi-part alternative is not often honored by the sender. And in fact, the sender often doesn't know that they're using it. And I regularly get mail that doesn't make any sense, and then I switch to the text HTML part, and I learn that the content is entirely different. And the majority of the semantics for what, as far as I can tell, the vendors that are flaunting their use of multi-part alternative these days is, we know how to stuff a tricky thing into the email summary that you see in your inbox, because that's what the text plain part gets used for in some mail user agents, and that doesn't have anything to do with the content of the message. So I'm just observing that multi-part alternative and some of the other pieces can be very subtly abused. Yeah, and then related, and then even when you have a multi-part alternative and then you have multi-part related and you have HTML that has images, do they get attached to the related, or are they subpart? I mean, I don't think we know how to do it in email, and we've been trying to do it for 40 years, 30 years at least in email. And so importing that into MLS might or might not be what you actually want to do.
Paula, speaking as an individual. I'm a little worried about the part where you say if the media type is empty, the first media type is assumed, because this is a typical thing where there's a list of 10 media types and 10 years down the line, nobody uses the first entry anymore. Everybody switched to the fifth one. And now there's a bug in some 10-year-old code. And now you can send a malicious message that triggers you to use that code path that you haven't used for 10 years. Is there a way to make this like a mandatory field that is just always clear?
Well, so I'll point out that if people don't, this is a proposal. So if people don't ever want to have a sort of an abbreviated way and always want to send a media type, then we can just remove the first media type as assumed. And so that's one discussion. Separately, this issue of having a group that has the first media type live around forever, even after nobody wants it anymore, that MLS has a group, it's called the group context extension or something like that. There's a proposal type that you can send to the group that updates your group extensions so that everybody agrees that these are the new extensions. And so that would be an easy way to update the required media types extension to have a different list. And all you would require is that all of the members at that moment in that epoch had support for the media types that were in the required media types list, the new list.
Okay, that makes me slightly less worried, but still worried.
Ted?
So I wanted to kind of go back to a bigger principle here, because as I was thinking when Daniel Kahn-Gilmore was talking about multi-part, I was thinking, oh yeah, and multilingual. Don't get me started, right? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff where in order to get the multilingual stuff to look even vaguely realistic, you have to know a whole bunch more than you could possibly get into this structure, and frankly, a whole bunch more even than the MIME parameters typically tell you. So what I would suggest here is that you actually consider, instead of making this people can send anything, that you actually consider starting out with this being an MLS registry of MIME types that are permitted. And you can decide whenever you get the registry expert assigned what level that needs to be, right? Whether it's like all of image is okay and people can send whatever proposal for the image type that's cool, or they can send anything for text and that's cool. And if somebody tells you that they want to add, font or model or multi-part, you go down and say, okay, we're going to say these are now described in a way that these are comprehensible, and we can say yes, right? Then this is okay. So you might end up saying multi-part report is the multi-part that's accepted into the registry where image / is, just to that level of differentiation. Because I have a strong suspicion that over time you would develop the muscle that would say this is an easy job for the registry expert 4 years, 5 years in, but the first few going through, people really are going to have somebody like Murray, who's done with media type registration for a long time, to sit down with them and say, have you thought about X? And do you understand what it's going to mean when you do something that's like a binary type, which doesn't convey any actual semantics, or something like MP4, where it's all actually inside the container and the media type doesn't tell you anything? Have you thought about what that's going to mean? And I think maybe making this draw it from a registry where you have a registry expert and move toward a more open and open registry policy over time may be a better route to success. Because really opening it up from the beginning, I think you're going to lose interoperability really fast, especially with the vendor types. And that's going to be a shame.
Okay. So one thing I wanted to clarify, Ted, I think you meant probably like a Mimi specific registry, because like for MLS, like I could use MLS to distribute fonts among my laser printers, and I could have an MLS group that I use to exchange those fonts, and I could use the font type. And that would be like up to me to figure out how to make that work nicely. But for instant messaging, like I would want a profile that says, I only want to use these types and with these parameters and under these conditions.
That's absolutely correct. And my apologies for being less than precise there.
No worries. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. So, all right, so we had a lot of discussion about the content negotiation part of this, but if we want to use an MLS extension in order to signal any of this, then some of this work probably needs to happen in the MLS working group. And so then a question is, do we want to do this work? Do we want this work to go into the generic extension? Do we want the extension part to go into a generic extensions document? Do we want a separate document? Is this a reasonable start to that problem if we want to do that problem? So there are a number of questions here. So I would like to, and I just wanted to say like, that please, if you got something that you want to say about, I don't like this or I like that or whatever, please try to focus on the semantics first, because I really don't care very much about the syntax of this document. I want to get the semantics right, and most of the comments of the mic have all been about semantics, so I'm quite pleased about that. So maybe I will pass it over to Sean to talk about
Right. So the reason why this obviously isn't in the extensions draft is because it's kind of a little different than some of the other things. The first thing is actually a question that we have to ask our area director, is because this will be the first thing that is about enabling interoperability among the applications, where specifically the charter says we won't do that. Now, we didn't do it in the base protocol. We're going to do it in an extension. So if you look at it, all right, I think it probably could fit. But this would be a question, because it specifically said it is not a goal of this group to enable interoperability, federation between messaging applications beyond the key establishment, authentication, and confidentiality services. So but I would look at that as kind of like in the base protocol. This is an extension. So I kind of see like, I could fit, and we won't have to like change the cart charter or whatever to like call it extensions, but it would be the first thing. So, and you'll note that the discussion that we had for 20 minutes about media types is one of the reasons why this working group didn't want to do any of that, because it's all a specialized expertise area that not a lot of us have. So I guess really the question is, are there people that are interested in kind of doing this? Because Rowan's definitely, been talking about this for a while.
So I'll bring up an analogy that came up when we discussed this a bit earlier, which is to TLS and ALPN. On the one hand, that seems to me to argue that like doing this in the MLS working group should be pretty fine. We might need to tweak the charter language that Sean mentioned. But if TLS could do ALPN, which talks about the things happening at the next layer up, this seems analogous. That kind of makes me wonder if this might be a little simpler, if it were a little bit more like ALPN in terms of abstraction, so that you could have, say, a generic protocol identifier that could say, what goes on inside the payload. So you have a syntax here for what goes inside the message payloads. Maybe a different app wants to do it differently, or something like that. I'm not sure that's worth the extra indirection, but it is an approach out there. I think generally in terms of where this lives, it kind of comes down on to how much of the complexity that was just discussed we're going to have to take on here. If this is at the layer of just kind of string comparison, I think it's probably compact enough to take on here and take on in the, just put in the extensions document. If it's going to have to go into a whole bunch of MIME details, that might belong a little higher up the stack.
So I think that we didn't, can I see a show of hands of people who have read this in the working group? Maybe I could do a poll. I haven't done that this week. Let's see if I can do that. Is that a poll? It's a gallery view. Where's the note taking tool? Show of hands tool. Let's do that.
While you're firing that up, I'm just going to repeat something that's a comment Ted made in the chat, that the MLS ALPN sort of thing I was meaning would be like to have an extension in MLS that says, this is me, and then whatever content negotiation you did would be, the specifics of the content negotiation would be specific to the MIMI protocol.
Yeah, so if you read it, I'm starting a poll. Just raise your hand if you read it. I mean, we got, out of 10 people, we got 5. That's pretty good, actually. All right, so are there any objections to adopting this draft? Obviously, assuming that Paul says yes, it's good, and we're not going to get slapped down because of the charter. Are there any objections to it? Raphael?
Yeah, I think the point you brought up, so it's not an objection per se, but the point you just brought up, Sean, is quite important, because the nature of the discussion we're having now, it's fundamentally different from the discussions we've had in the past around MLS. And you bring up a good point where the question is really whether the expertise that is required for this kind of discussions, is within the MLS working group at this point. So obviously there are some experts. We saw that in the past 20 minutes, but I'm wondering if, from a technical perspective, it wouldn't be even better if that was done somewhere else. Like I think in the comment section was just from Ted, question whether this couldn't punt the whole thing to, for example, the MIMI working group to be something like that.
I mean, that is an open question, right? And there's also
that's an open question, yes, for me.
And there's also been precedent where a working group took it, and then if MIMI, like we start it, and then if MIMI takes off, we can give it to them, right? Like at the end of the day, I think Rohan doesn't really care, just wants to get it done. But
yeah, so Paolo City. So the important thing I think is that any of these discussions don't delay the core documents, that we get those things out first. Then we have some time to find out what's the best space for this document to go to.
So Rohan, I know you were looking for a working group call for adoption, but I think we're gonna wait a little bit and try to beat the drum to get people going. And yeah, I mean, so the great part is you're actually leading the effort for MIMI as well. So if we get that kicked off and going, maybe it's the first, maybe it's the thing they do, or we do it here, because it is kind of simple, but it is kind of thorny. So all right, and that brings us to the end of our agenda. Does anyone else have anything to add? All right, well, thank you very much, and safe travel homes, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
All right. Good stuff. Still on, yeah, still on. I thought you turned it off. There we go. Still on.
Yeah, Jonathan's